And good evening, everybody. Welcome to this last session of the Forum on the Next System. My name is Ben Manski. I'm Assistant Professor of Public Sociology at George Mason University and Director of Next System Studies. And I am pleased to have such a wonderful group of people to have this conversation with tonight. I'm not pleased about what we have to have the conversation about. But I am glad that we are coming together in the way that we have been all day and that we are at this moment to talk about nonviolent civil resistance and system change in the context of the military occupation of parts of Los Angeles, uh, Washington, D.C., and the threats to send in um, military and federal police officers into other cities, including, of course, Chicago, and now we're hearing earlier as we were gathering New Orleans as well. So the work that we are doing, it's a reminder that the work that we are doing is very much relevant to this moment in U.S. history, one of the most decisive moments in which we are so lucky in which to be alive, perhaps, in the history of this country. And I say that half ironically. And so the question I'm going to start us off with is a very open question because I want to give our panelists a chance to share with us their thoughts. We've all, of course, been thinking very deeply about this moment and about how we get from where we are to where we must go. But I want to just ask you broadly about the relationship between nonviolent resistance and movements to build the next system in the here and now, and how you understand that relationship. And I'm going to start with my friend and new colleague, Jamila Raqib, who is the executive director of the Albert Einstein Institution in Boston. So please welcome Jamila.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much for convening us for this important discussion at a time of such great urgency, but also opportunity for our country. And I say opportunity because I think inherent in this question of how we can both resist effectively in this moment, but also build the institutions that come next is a bit of a subtext, a recognition. And that's that in the midst of the severe crisis we face, I mean, we're all aware of the attacks on our communities and on our political system. Um, we have an opportunity and a shared responsibility to make sure that the system that emerges from this crisis is one that is more just and democratic, and also that it can be defended, that we avoid the very problems that brought us to this moment. And obviously, the situation couldn't get more urgent. Clearly, you're all very well informed people, and you might have heard that on Sunday night, the government tried to deport 76 children who came to the United States as unaccompanied minors from Guatemala. And they did this at 3 in the morning on a holiday weekend, right? In the middle of Labor Day. And they, woke these children up, put them on planes, one of which actually took off and then was forced to turn around after a judge, temporarily blocked the deportation. So it's just horrifying and shocking. Imagine children being woken up in the middle of the night to be put on planes to be deported. I mean, that's the state of our country. It's a shocking display of cruelty, but it's also a tactic that's straight out of the authoritarian playbook to create fear and confusion in order to carry out violations before people have a chance to organize or even to understand what's happening. So my mentor and the founder of the Albert Einstein Institution, Gene Sharp, talks about this book. He has a book called The Anti-Coup, which is a small guide on how people can resist coups and other kind of illegal takeovers and power grabs. And he says that's why coups have historically been, carried out at night to force this compliance. So people will wake up and kind of wake up to a new reality that then they feel powerless to resist. Um, and he says the antidote to these sorts of, attacks is to resist powerlessness and apathy and passivity and confusion and to act quickly, right? And we feel the sense of urgency in our communities and in our political discourse. And I think a lot of a lot of us here will be familiar with the work of our colleague Erica Chenoweth, and which the research says that struggles that have mobilized 3.5% of the population are very likely to succeed. But some people have taken this 3.5 number to mean that if only we can get 12 million people in the streets, that, success is just around the corner. It's inevitable. So clearly we know the numbers are important, but how we act and what we do matters. And the effective tactics and strategies in this moment, like in every other moment of crisis, have to stem from a good understanding of our opponents, about their capabilities, not just their intentions, which are very difficult to predict, although some of them are quite openly announced and telegraphed, as we said earlier, but their actual capabilities, the capabilities that are going to be mobilized against us, but also the capabilities of our movement and calculations on how to time and target our actions. And there's a rigor to this process that we simply can't bypass if we're going to be truly effective. So an important piece for me of this question of how to do resistance effectively is to recognize that protests and street mobilizations are just one tool in the whole repertoire of action available to us. Gene Sharp cataloged the diversity of methods that have been historically carried out, right? And he has this list of 198 methods, but let's remember that list is from 1973. Clearly, it has it was not meant to be definitive. It's grown a lot, and it's growing every day as people are kind of inventing new methods and experimenting with methods. So let's be creative about the actions that we have available to us. So the methods as we've cataloged them, or as he cataloged them, are include the methods of protest and persuasion, the actions we associate with nonviolent resistance, but sometimes equate with them. And I'm talking about public displays of dissatisfaction, demonstrations and protests and vigils and petitions and those sorts of things. But there's also the methods of non-cooperation, which take social, political, and economic form. So when people stop supporting or obeying oppressive systems in order to weaken them, things like strikes and boycotts, but also refusing to assist government agents, judicial non-cooperation, a lot of the sorts of things that we're seeing in our country today, also civil disobedience. And then the last and I think most important and maybe most powerful category of the methods is the methods of nonviolent intervention, which includes the institution building piece, right? That's sort of the topic of our discussion today. And this is where the movement builds power, not just to conduct resistance, but also the power to transition to a more just system. And I think we talk a lot about power these days, right? The need to build power. And we sometimes think about powers in terms of numbers, and we've seen huge mobilizations around the world that do very little to change things, or actually change policies, to change systems. Because equally important is the quality of the participation. How diverse and representative is it? How disciplined and well trained is it? Do people have a clear alternative vision for society? Or are we mostly uniting out of opposition to the status quo? And I think here trainings play a really important role in improving the quality of participation. So Gina Sharp always said, even though numbers are potential power, real social and political power is built and it's exercised through creation and strengthening of institutions. Gandhi was also very clear about this. He called these efforts constructive programs. And he said, expecting people to take action, especially action that's risky, especially when they feel weak, that's dangerous. And I feel like our movements sometimes do that because it means that their predictable defeat, or maybe their likely defeat, is going to send them the message that they're as helpless as they thought they were, and maybe a very long time before they act again. And Gandhi was the master non-cooperation strategist. And he said, as non-cooperation campaigns weaken and disrupt oppressive institutions and systems, new ones have to be built to take their place. And he, and I think other wise movement leaders throughout history and ones around the world today, leaders of the civil rights movement and anti-apartheid movement and Polish solidarity movement and UPOR, among others, understood that even unjust and corrupt institutions do meet some societal needs, including intangible ones, like they give people a sense of belonging and purpose. So is our movement doing that? We have to fill the gap by creating new organizations and groups that deliver that sense of purpose and belonging. So there's a psychosocial aspect to movement work, and that we have to incorporate into our narratives and into our strategies. But doing away with these oppressive institutions that are harming us, without alternatives to take their place also obviously creates a lot of other disruptions to basic needs like food, safety, and security. And we saw this in a really incredible movement that took place last summer in Bangladesh, where there was a massive nonviolent uprising that removed their authoritarian leader. And at one point, police basically vacated the streets, which could have meant massive chaos, which would have directly played into the hands of the old regime and would have really set back the movement. But the students stepped in and they took over things like directing traffic and making sure the situation didn't, devolve into lawlessness. Uh, so we saw this, or we studied this in the Montgomery bus boycott, where civil rights leaders could have said, it's an unjust system we face. Figure out how to get to work, to church, to the hospital, to school, because people relied on the buses. But instead of doing that, they built a very sophisticated carpool system, which had a lot to do, I think, with the sustainability of a campaign that lasted, imagine, 381 days before, ride shares and all of that. So the lesson here, I think, for all of us is, creating these decentralized ways of meeting the needs of our communities that are affected by the non-cooperation and disruption that we are going to see as we have system failures on every level in our country, is not only an ethical necessity, but really a strategic one. And then just really quickly, the second piece of this is that not only are these institutions necessary for effective resistance, but they're also going to play a role in the transition. And a lot of the new research on democratic transitions shows that these institutions that are created for resistance have a major role to play in preventing democratic backsliding after an initial victory is won. There's some incredible examples. I'm looking forward to learning more from all of you about how people are building these new, more democratic systems, here in the United States, in DC and Chicago and LA and Boston and elsewhere, that offer a lot of insight and I think replicable models that we can draw from. And I look forward to learning more. Because when these democratic decision-making systems and governance systems are integrated into resistance movements, they become really powerful weapons in our, nonviolent arsenal. And I'll just end by saying let's be creative about how we think about these institutions, because they can be both formal and informal, political and non-political. And maybe there's something to be learned from really repressive societies where political action is heavily monitored. People organize around all kinds of different groups, like reading clubs and gardening groups and sports clubs and professional associations. We saw professional associations of doctors play a huge role in the Sudanese resistance. And you know, we need to figure out, and also artists, let's not forget them. We need to identify how to, name these groups, empower them, and see them for what they are, which are, pockets of power. People are increasingly getting activated. They're having discussions in these groups. They're organizing in these sort of decentralized spaces. And these groups are looking to carve out roles for themselves. So I think a major priority for all of us, which I really look forward to discussing, is how to equip these decentralized groups with tools and insights, and case studies that they can use to design action and then carry out that action independently, even when there's no central strategy or leadership to guide them. And we're seeing the proliferation of trainings in the U.S. today, which is a really good sign. I think these efforts just need to be strengthened, because I think ultimately these pockets of community and solidarity that already exist are, I think, one of the main pillars and really one of our best hopes for defending democracy in this moment of urgency, but not just doing that, but also shaping the kind of future we have. So I'll just end there. Thank you very much. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jamila. And that with that a sense of seriousness and also optimism and a way forward, I think that provides an excellent transition to what I'm guessing you're going to address. Stephanie Brancaforte, who is these days Senior Climate Advisor to Public Citizen here in the United States. And I know you bring an international perspective as well to your work. So I'm looking forward to what you have to share with us. Thank you, Jamila. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. And that was an absolutely wonderful overview and introduction, Jamila. It's delightful to be able to follow your remarks when you've, I think, laid out the context so clearly. Yes, I come to you primarily as somebody who has had a lot of experience in trying to bring down authoritarians in different parts of the world. And like, yes, there's definitely a playbook that we're often fighting against. We see the same kinds of behaviors. I would say that while there's some creativity in oppression, there's much more creativity in resistance. And I think every moment of challenge requires new movements and new methods. We can certainly learn from the past, but right now we're facing in the United States, the best resourced sort of like military oppressor that we've seen, with 150 billion new dollars for private security and detention, with the surveillance state that we probably couldn't have imagined before. And the full weight of well, almost the entire weight of the branches of government. So we have our work cut out for us. At the same time, Americans are innovative, and I think when they get pushed enough, they can be extremely resourceful. And the fascists always fail in the end. The question is how quickly and how much damage can they exact. In the meantime, how fast can we resist to moderate or minimize that damage. To build on what Jamila has been saying, because I think we think about sort of authoritarians being like resting on different pillars that constitute their power. Whether those are like the media, the parts of the government, the bureaucracy, et cetera. It's like how do we really think about reconstructing those pillars into something that serves communities, that serves our cities, that serves our people. And if we think about a normal sort of authoritarian state and like what the priorities typically are, the first one is security forces. How do we prevent them from shooting us? Obviously, we're seeing massive amount of violence and abuse from ICE. I think we have National Guard, which is a bit on the fence, and still fairly solid situation with some of the others. But I think one of the things that we all need to think about is how do we message, how do we communicate to the people in our security forces who are all part of our communities too. Sorry. And because that's that can be definitely make or break for, especially in terms of the level of danger. Sorry, I should have premised all of this by saying I think at the moment fighting the fascists and system change are absolutely one and the same thing, and what we are witnessing and experiencing right now is simply the extreme excess of corporate power and concentration of wealth, excess capitalism, and in its sort of boldest, and I wouldn't say unchecked form, because much of it is highly manipulated, and the rules have been highly rewritten to favor a few. But trying to change the system and be successful in a way that's sustainable is exactly the same thing as a system change. System change, as far as I'm concerned, at the moment. And as Jamila was saying, visibility actions and like visible forms of resistance are very important in these moments, to show others that they can be brave too. I think one of my friends sort of described it as, how can we all help each other grow the biggest pair of balls possible? However you want to say that in a more polite way, but I think that's one of our responsibilities at the moment, to be brave, to be visibly brave, to show that the regime doesn't have all of the power that sometimes we think it does. And how do we, how can we actually help one another to do those kinds of brave actions? I think in the United States, again, because of the sort of creeping corporate power, we as individuals are so much less secure than people in quite a lot of other countries. Like, we don't have sort of like pueblo in many like in most communities that sort of sustains and supports us. Like, we've sort of blasted a lot of the normal community structures, and we with health insurance, like we're sort of the government has us over a barrel if it wants to, or sort of society does, just given how structures have grown up. So I think in order to support, like in this revolution, like more than any other, I think having structures of mutual aid, what Jamila was referring to as well, like very like building structures that can support us in this time of sort of crisis and transition is absolutely fundamental. Like, how can we really show up for one another? What are the structures that we can build, and how can we do it in a decentralized enough fashion that it's not extremely vulnerable to to the surveillance state and so on. Yeah, and I think then the usual things that apply in trying to change the system, which is a lot of the exposing corporate abuses and misdeeds. In this case, of course, especially as it connects to the logistics and bureaucracy of oppression, and we've seen really wonderful campaigning with against Avelo, and now increasingly against Palantir, and some of the companies that have been like benefiting the most directly and most sort of in bed with the regime. So I think, yeah, those are some of the points that I wanted to make, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. There's so much more to say, Jamila. I could talk to you for hours too. But thank you so much for bringing us together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we won't have hours tonight, but we're certainly beginning this particular discussion, and thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us. And it's I think these are really important connections at this moment. So thank you. I'm going to turn. Speaking of new connections, in some case, in case with Stephanie, it's an old connection, reconnection, but new connections to Slobodan Milic, who is an organizer these days with Free DC, but like everybody else here, has done many other things in the past. And really want to thank you for taking time out from what is a very busy time for people in DC and in Chicago right now, and in New Orleans and other places. Thank you, Slobo. Looking forward to what you have to share to start us out.
Good evening, everyone, and greetings from Washington, D.C., the capital of the Democratic Republic of the United States. The capital, yet a colony itself, a place occupied by the federal government of the United States. This city of about 700,000 people have been given some rights, not the rights of representation or the rights to choose its own attorney general, for example. But DC has always been an odd case, and residents have had limited political rights for centuries now, especially since 1870s, when the federal government got scared of the rising political power of people of color, who have been majority residents of Washington, DC. This racial dynamic persists today. DC has a very limited autonomy, so-called home rule, and due in part to the fact that its large black and immigrant population votes Democrat. If it were a Republican stronghold, DC may have been a state a long time ago. So how does the federal colonial rule look today? Federal agencies like ICE and HSI run random checkpoints across the city. They are illegally kidnapping our neighbors who are in the process of becoming citizens. So we have armed Praetorian guards from a dozen states patrol streets in uniforms. We have a federally imposed Attorney General Jeanine Pirro, who is changing the gun laws and allowing residents from elsewhere to open carry rifles and other guns. And all this is under the pretext that DC's crime rates are high and that this city needs to be made safe and beautiful. So DC has crime. And as someone who grew up in Europe, I am still not used to how violent cities in the United States are. And this should be an absolute priority for governments at every level. But that all being said, DC's violent crime rates in 2024 had been the lowest in 30 years. And this figure comes from Department of Justice from just a few months ago. So this is just one of the several lines of attack on DC's autonomy. For example, the federal administration prevented DC from spending 1.1 billion of its own money collecting through our taxes. And part of this money was, by the way, going to be spent on police anyways. It is against this backdrop that Free DC movement started organizing into a civic resistance movement. So what is Free DC? We are a renewed effort to protect DC's autonomy against federal takeover, renewed because there is a long history of struggle for basic political rights that are normalized anywhere else in the United States. We're talking about the rights to elect our representatives, to spend our money the way we want, nothing radical really. But at this moment, sadly, we are not even looking at the statehood. We just want the federal forces out of our communities. Federal agents are violent, they're profiling, harassing, arresting mostly Black and brown DC community members. They are disappearing people into unmarked cars without identification. And these agents are really moving like gangs through neighborhoods, asking people for papers. They are tackling food delivery drivers. They are harassing people sometimes just for smoking cigarettes. And because they're not identified themselves, people in DC have no way of knowing where their loved ones have been taken. So how is this being received in DC? Free DC has been recruiting people at record-breaking levels. There have been numerous occasions where we had to close down registration for our events or trainings because capacities were filled within hours. Our online orientations sometimes have 800 participants. But we have gone beyond just training and into this wonderful world of direct action and non-cooperation. Free DC is not about technical policy fixes. Our strategy is in non-violent civic struggle. To be clear, we're still in the opening phases of the struggle, and everyone should be prepared for a marathon. This is what we train people on, to sustain low-intensity activism for a long period of time. And we show them examples from United States. Jamila mentioned the Montgomery bus boycott, for example. It lasted 13 months, right? We also discussed models that were used in Chile, in Serbia, which took years to produce results. And we co-designed direct actions that Gene Sharp would instantly recognize, from boycotts of businesses that power ICE, to mutual aid and support for immigrant communities, to rapid response to ICE checkpoints, to their arrests. I am personally involved, among other groups, in Free Spirits, which is a Free DC group that built relationships with core supporters of the women's soccer club Washington Spirit. And it's a lot of fun to get the whole stadium to chant Free DC in the 51st minute of every game, in relation to the 51st state that we want to become. But it's also preparing for a potential media blackout. I personally have lived in several countries where soccer stadiums provided the only free forum for any dissenting opinions. And we are actively working on claiming these kind of spaces in advance, because we don't know what's coming. Another core strategy of ours, and this is also based on patterns that Gene Sharp described, is to utilize cycles of repression and response. We are now building on repression. We are really starting to annoy them. We heckle Janine Pirro, for example, wherever she shows up. We get arrested in the Senate when we obstruct committees that discuss bills that are against DC's interests. We take up space in the city. We are really loud and obnoxious. But we know that repression is coming toward us, and we are ready for it. And we are training hundreds of people every week on how to get ready for this backlash. So we have seen this around the world. We know that very soon the administration is going to do something really stupid. And this is going to be first of series of their mistakes, and each one is going to be followed by stronger backlash. So what's the end game here? What we hope for, beyond this U-turn in democratic backsliding, is that to get a better system at the end of this U-turn. So some countries have succeeded at this, and those were the countries where civic movements were organized in solidarity around positive visions for their societies, rather than focusing only on destroying the corrupt regimes. And this is why we insist at every chance we get on building communities, connecting neighbors, crowdsourcing ideas for the future DC we all want to live in. We have to come out a stronger, more just, more compassionate society. Otherwise, we wasted a unique window of opportunity to make a civilizational step forward for the generations to come.
Thank you so much, Slobo. Really inspiring. And And thank you for all the leadership on the front lines and showing that kind of courage that was called for by Stephanie and by Jamila as well. And really want to express my personal appreciation to you for that, and as somebody who lives down the road. Further down the road is the city of Chicago, which anybody who has been in any space that I've been in speaking publicly over the last year knows that I've been pointing to Chicago as the city that was going to turn the tide. And that is difficult for me to say as a Wisconsinite. You see Wisconsin, the Wisconsin wave behind me there. But there are amazing things going on in Chicago. And I know April Donor, who is a facilitator with Chicago Peace Fellows, and also is among the last three, plus myself, are part of a team. The last three panelists and myself are part of a team that are working on launching the next phase of the next system project. So April is involved with that as well. So April, looking forward to your remarks. Thanks again, Slobo.
Thank you. Thank you all. Really resonating with what everyone has shared so far. So yes, joining you on the potential eve of troops coming in. A lot of folks are just not sure exactly when it might happen. But I've been just in frenzied conversation with many different people this week to get my own clearer picture on what's happening and who's preparing. And yeah, so in here, you know, there's a lot of fear. And of course, that is building on just existing fear from the invasion of ICE over the last, you know, months, and many people from immigrant populations who are scared in their homes, folks who work with them having to pivot, having to find new ways to work, a lot of organizing around that, right? So this is another wave, right, that's coming at us. And I think zooming out, what I'm seeing is the silver lining of what a lot of us are talking, right? This is the opportunity to build in new ways, to cohere in new ways. So that's also what we're seeing. A friend of mine who works with immigrant and refugee populations has said that this is the first time he's ever seen in his career that a lot of beef is being set aside, a lot of histories of, you know, politics and relationships that keep different groups from working together that have the same mandate, right? But are often stuck in competing for funds and competing for clients, are just saying, you know what, we need to set that aside. And we have to find ways to not only work together, but share resources, unify those things so that more and more people can join and help us and find the resources that they need to protect their neighbors, right? So we're also seeing cohering across political lines, across movements. The Labor Day March was historic. It was enormous this Monday, and it was the first time that I've seen these different groups in movement space with each other, right? So these new kind of no kings, newly activated folks and populations through those spaces like Indivisible, No Kings, and 5051 now in space with, you know, folks who have been doing working class rooted labor organizing for decades, and have such a legacy here in Chicago alongside, you know, pro-Palestinian marchers. And right, so incredible new cohesion and coherence happening, which, and of course, I know that this outward physical thing that we're seeing in the demonstration is a reflection of more cohesion and coherence happening behind the scenes. We're seeing a lot of organizing around faith-based groups, pastors coming together in company with our mayor, who is pushing back. And one thing that I've been talking about with others, including Ben, is, you know, a lot of what we can see here is that this comes on the heels of the legacy of Chicago, right, which has a history of building its own systems. My background is in asset-based community development. My mentor, John McKnight, was trained in Alinsky-style organizing, which of course has its home in Chicago. And his work was an evolution of that, which really drilled down into the relational necessity of organizing, right? That people not only need to be fighting against, but they need to be in community with one another. They need to be creating what they want to see. They need to be caring for one another. And I think that the moment we're at is, you know, after many years that I've spent trying to bridge the gap of, you know, folks who are in this more community building, lovely space, and the folks who are in the fight space. This is the moment where I think none of us can afford to be in different spaces to get anymore. And while it's difficult to find where our lenses overlap, succinctly and perfectly, I think there's an urgency and a desire there that I'm seeing on both sides with folks who I'm talking to. Folks in the neighborhood level, there's still some sense of, we're keeping our head down, we're working with our people, this stuff doesn't necessarily affect us. But then on those one-on-one conversations where I'm able to, we're able to talk about, how are the issues that are affecting them linked to our economic system? How is that linked to what we're now seeing coming down the pike with the new authoritarian government, right? There is openness and there's an interest in connecting the dots. And I would say that, on building on what other panelists have shared, that, right, that desire for a community, that desire for things like mutual aid, that desire for something that is other than just the classic demonstrating out in the streets, is that sweet spot for many people. It's that sweet spot for the folks who have been doing the community building work and haven't been necessarily applying a political lens to it to see their relevance. And many times, their personality, their character, their networks are rooted in that work, right? But for them to see, oh, I have this incredible role, right? In not only doing work that is resistance, but building a new system, that's incredibly refreshing and exciting to people. And also, as we're all seeing, there are unprecedented numbers of people who are newly worried, who are for the first time just scared, about our country and where it's headed, and haven't been thinking super politically or about alternative systems, but they're ready to in new ways, right? So having those kinds of options to realize, wow, gardening with my neighbors, caring for my neighbors, and then maybe when it's the moment, helping my neighbors avoid getting deported because I know they're good people. These are these syntheses of resistance and building that I think is our chance to really lean into. And then the last thing I think I'm really taking a cautionary tale around is building on other legacies of Chicago, where we've really seen a lot of the history of organizing fall prey to the nonprofit industrial complex, right? Which then is, of course, prey to our federal government. But because we're seeing those cuts, those cruel cuts in folks' livelihoods, who got to do great work in this nonprofit world, doing community building, doing direct service, and now realizing, wow, okay, like we cannot rely on these systems. But we have legacies to draw upon. We have elders and we have young people who are linked to those elders, the legacies like the Lincoln Park resistance, right? And the Rainbow Coalition that formed there, where the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and the Young Patriots united across race lines to fight the capitalists backed by the police, backed by the power structure here. And that, they were successfully blending deeply embedded neighborhood level relational organizing with, visionary system change work with direct resistance, right? So we have that legacy. The other cautionary tale alongside that is that, if we just come in with systems change talk and political agendas, it will probably not resonate with those doing the deep relational work. And that's what I've heard from folks who were on the ground in the 60s and 70s, that groups like the SDS, however refined and great their lines were, it just didn't hit home because they didn't have relationships with folks in the neighborhood. They weren't there on the ground with folks. So, I think I agree. I think that we're going through birthing pains of the new system, and we're experiencing waves and waves of this that are giving us a chance to sharpen our lens and lean deeply into relationship while inviting others to do so at the same time, while we recognize this is part of resistance, this is part of building a new system.
Thank you so much, April. And I know you have more to share from conversations with the mayor and folks with Chicago Teachers Union later on when we come back. Really appreciate all the work you've done this past week, especially in having those conversations and bringing it to us. And I'm looking forward to the conversation when we turn to that. I'm going to now go to Matt Nelson. Matt Nelson is Executive Director of Presente.org. And also, as I mentioned, involved with this next phase of the Next System project. Welcome, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who is gathering here all day and for this session we really need each other in these times, and yeah, just much love and appreciation. Yes. So let's continue to get into it, because, my colleagues on this panel have really brought some very deep critical aspects of this. And so, yeah, I hope to, I'm looking forward to not just this panel, but the continuation. Where to begin? I guess I'll begin with just my love of cities. I deeply love and care about cities. The city I was born in, Medellin, Colombia, in recent years has gone from one of the most violent places on earth to a place where there is a affirmative human right to water, where there is progressive taxation, where there is a community of love and solidarity and mutual aid that has really, it is a society transformed in many ways. It is a place that is rebuilding in terms of its climate resistance. And so I just want to mention some of my love of cities. Of course, I love the city that I grew up in the Twin Cities. Love to see how Minneapolis is really rebuilding from a city that could have gone the way in the mid-90s of stripping all of its social safety net and going down the route of massive economic failure and racism and segregation, but chose a different path. Of course, I'm in love with my city that I'm considered honorary from, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, with its 50-year history of socialist mayors. And I'm in love with my current city of Oakland, California, the birthplace of the Black Panther Party, and a place that, if you know, the inner workings of Oakland's community will always have your back, as long as you also reciprocate your love and commitment to these communities of struggle. And so cities have always been places of resistance and resilience and struggle. And they've also, US cities, and they've also been places of deep experimentation on communities of color, such as welfare privatization and other horrible, horrible experiments on communities of color. They've always been places where the bludgeoned of white supremacy and corporate domination have often come together to smash on so many of our loved ones in our cities. I want to talk nationally, but I want to first just tell a little story of I worked very closely in holding our violent police force in Milwaukee accountable to the community. And there was one particular officer who was a terrible, terrible officer. Brutality. He stretched the bounds of brutality as a uniformed officer from the Milwaukee Police Department. What was worse was when he was out of his uniform and he was a violent rogue member of a police gang within the police department, and he would torture people. And so while you could see the instance of him, like, as an officer, dragging people, arresting people, punching through car windows, as a non-officer, the torture that he would do to the community was I can't even mention here. And I say that to say that, yes, we are concerned about the National Guard, even though, it's good that they're gardening and picking up trash. We are deeply concerned about ICE with their 10 times the budget that they have. We are horrified by this third force of police and law enforcement that is patrolling our cities. And a lot of the times people are asking, well, how come these folks are masked? They're covering their identities. They don't have badges. They don't have uniforms. Well, the reason is, in many cases, because they don't have badges or uniforms, because they aren't official police. They are, in many cases, white supremacists who, pun intended, are apprenticing to be part of the new private police force. And that is where the focus should be. I think the focus should not necessarily be on the guard. It should be on how are we allowing this massive, massive private gang, call them what you want. I think apprentices are good examples, to essentially terrorize our communities. And and I think we have to understand how much recruitment is happening here, how much importance. And think about 10 years ago, if you went to a Trump rally and protested, would the police arrest you? No. What would happen? Trump would say, ask his supporters to beat you up and throw you out. So this is a continuation of that agenda. And I'm no fascism historian or scholar, but from what I understand, this is one of the roots of fascism, is having a president's own private, violent, militarized police force that's not accountable. And it certainly is not the National Guard. So I also think that they do have a lot of power, but they have, thankfully, little competence. And so there's a priority of loyalty over competence in this thing. But I think part of what we're seeing is that they're also adapting to that. And you also see like all of this violence, but you see also relatively low arrests for the amount of violence, the 10x budget. But they're now sort of saying, okay, we need military lawyers to be judges. We need more JAG courts set up. Why? So we can prosecute and arrest more people. And so that's what's also coming to our cities, that we actually have some time to prepare against. And just a couple of this trend is like, if folks remember before Trump-pocalypse 2.0, there was a massive trend after 2020, after the uprisings in Minneapolis and all across the country, of cop cities. And cop cities were a different model than policing, in the modern policing in the United States, because they were often funded private police union, police foundation unions. And so I think it's similar to that. I think the trend of like private prison companies boldly saying that they believe they're an arm of the government is again this deep confluence of the worst of white supremacy and the worst of corporate domination being recruited into a pipeline. I call it the unemployed white supremacist jobs program that they're creating in our cities. Even though a lot of these folks are employed as police officers already, they're just moonlighting as part of this violent, unaccountable police force. And so I do think that part of the hope is to exploit the incompetence. Part of the hope is to, if we can address some of these underlying failed economic systems that have led to massive inequality in our cities, I think we can get to building a universalized countervailing force to fascism. And I do have hope in the incredible organizing going on throughout cities, but also on the northern and southern borders of the United States. Looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Matt Nelson. I'm always learn new things when I hear you talk, and we talk often, so I'm learning all the time. Yeah, that gave me a lot to think about. So I'm trying to save time for this conversation because I want to hear more from each of you. So I'm not going to comment further. I'm going to go to Joe Guinan, who is president of the Democracy Collaborative and is located here in the DMV as well. So thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Joe. And then we're going to go into an active conversation. But I'm looking forward to your remarks, Joe.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks to your team for putting together this really important convergence. Thanks to everyone who's been participating. And it's a real honor to be on such an important and distinguished panel. And I have certainly been listening and learning from all the excellent panelists that have come before. I find myself in an unusual position at the moment, which is that having spent the last 25 years of my life working on long range, long term system change, on really thinking about systemic alternatives and what the transition looks like and the build up of the crisis, it's jarring to be in this moment when the crisis is here and the crisis is now and is unfolding. And so I find myself having to switch from the sort of grand analysis mode of understanding what's coming, thinking about the parameters of the crisis, thinking about what systemic change looks like and how we can bring it about, to moving also into resistance mode and to understanding what it is that our work can contribute to the immediate work that needs to be done and that's being done by so many of the people on this panel. And so one thing that the Democracy Collaborative has done in this period is we've begun a weekly news aggregator called Tracking the Crisis. TrackingTheCrisis.org is the place to go and sign up. And we're basically looking at everything that the Trump administration is doing on a week-to-week basis, but also looking at movement responses, at the resistance that's emerging, at patterns that are growing out of that. And we synthesize all this and put it into one weekly email, which goes out on a Friday afternoon. And the reason I'm mentioning this is not just for free advertising, but basically because I think this is one of the tools that we are using to respond to what we're actually facing, which is a very deliberate strategy of shock and awe, of what Steve Bannon has called flooding the zone, which is the decision by the Trumpies to move across a broad front and to really attempt in a serious fashion to shift the longstanding deadlock and stalemate in Washington and the deadlocked political economic system, which has been working very well for some people, but also has been pitching into crisis. And a lot of this will be familiar to anybody who has watched the global far right at work in countries elsewhere in the world, in Hungary, Italy, Poland, India, Brazil, Argentina, and elsewhere, places that many of the other panelists will know better than I do. And what we're seeing is an increasingly well-honed playbook that has essentially been imported to the United States, where the Republicans have been trying and failing for decades to shift and dismantle many aspects of the US federal government. And now they think they have an opportunity to do it. And in addition to this global playbook, of course, you'll all know that there's an extensive domestic playbook that's been put together as well in the shape of Project 2025, which is a 900-page playbook put together by over 100 of the leading organizations on the political right, led by the Heritage Foundation, with a really detailed program for transforming the entire federal government and indeed the country. And among the many actions Trump has taken are an array of actions and measures that were foreshadowed in Project 2025, aimed at reshaping the federal government, repurposing it, its aim, its reach, the functioning of the American state, and in whose interests it operates, regulates, and indeed represses and polices. And it's a sweeping agenda, and there are many questions that those of us who look at system change and systemic crisis can ask about the likelihood of success, given what we've already seen from Republican and Democratic presidents alike since the 70s. And there's especially questions about whether there can be any large order shifts that will really fundamentally reduce the size of government as a share of GDP, something that's been promised again and again since the Reagan administration, but that conservatives have signally failed to achieve historically. So some of this attempt at system change from the right in a situation of difficulty for them as well, is the context in which I think we've got to see this assault on the cities. Because part of shock and awe is going out and attacking sequentially across the board on a broad front in order to identify who resists and fights back in order to either go after them or to figure out a strategy for relating to those pockets of resistance that threaten indeed to lead to much more widespread resistance. And so Washington, D.C. in this regard, and Slobo covered this very well, was the obvious place to start because of its anomalous constitutional status, its lack of protections as a quasi-state that's much more of a colony of the federal government than it is a state. Weak to begin with by definition. And then I think we've also seen some weakness from the leadership of Washington, D.C. Muriel Bowser has essentially thrown in the towel in many regards. And she's also thrown other cities that are on Trump's list under the bus, most egregiously, of course, being her own. And I think we can expect a lot more capitulationism from Democratic electeds and from the DNC leadership as we go forward. But this, of course, doesn't mean it's over. And I'm very proud of my old neighborhood of 20 years in Washington, D.C., Columbia Heights, for the way in which they put up a fight recently, the way in which the community mobilized and came out. And I would just have to say, God bless you, Slobo, and Free DC for the work that you've been doing, because I do not know what we would be doing if you hadn't been there and the work and the groundwork hadn't been laid for a year. So very important, hats off and respect there. Community protection for community self-defense is the name of the game now, and it's coming soon to a major metropolitan area near all of you listening tonight. So the other thing to say is we're already seeing some cracks in the machine. We've heard a little bit about the difference between ICE and the National Guard. I was reading that the National Guard are on 29-day rotations, which means that they do 29 days and then they have a day off and then they get another 29-day cycle. And the reason for this is that if they were to do a 30-day tour, that would mean that they would be entitled to $2,500 worth of housing allowance. And so Trump is even screwing his own prospective brown shirts. And in fact, they're not brown shirts yet. And we should be looking at strategies to engage and to talk to these people as members of our community, as citizens in what is still pretending to be at least a democratic republic. And imagine what will happen if, when Trump rolls on to other cities, if at some point there's a decision really to stand and to fight. There's been an assumption, I think, and this is certainly their assumption, that cities are going to fall like dominoes, and that's on purpose. That was created in part by starting with Washington, D.C., where they had an easier lift, and deciding then to go and move on to harder nuts to crack. But by all accounts, next is Chicago. And imagine if Chicago were to stand and fight. Not for nothing is Chicago the beating heart of organized labor in the United States. I went back and dusted off from my shelf a copy of Jack London's old dystopian prescient novel about the rise of fascism, written long before it actually happened, The Iron Heel. And this is what Jack London had to say about Chicago. Chicago was the ripest of all. Chicago, which of old time was the city of blood and which was to earn anew its name. There the revolutionary spirit was strong. Too many bitter strikes had been curbed there in the days of capitalism for the workers to forget and forgive. Even the labor castes of the city were alive with revolt. Too many heads had been broken in the early strikes. Despite their changed and favorable conditions, their hatred for the master class had not died. This spirit had infected the mercenaries, of which 3 regiments in particular were ready to come over to us en masse. Chicago had always been the storm center of the conflict between labor and capital, a city of street battles and violent death, with a class-conscious capitalist organization and a class-conscious workman organization, where in the old days the very school teachers were formed into labor unions and affiliated with the hod carriers and bricklayers in the American Federation of Labor. And Chicago became the storm center of the premature first revolt. So we should pause there, right? Chicago was chosen on purpose as the beating heart of militant organized labor because it was there that they really wanted to crush resistance. And that should give us pause. But what if Chicago fights? What if Chicago were to say, what if the people of Chicago were to say, not in our city, not on our streets? What if when Trump comes in, Chicagoans were to shut everything down? What if there was actually a serious conversation, which I think is already beginning to take place, around a general strike, around the idea of launching citizens' assemblies in every neighborhood, around pushing Brandon Johnson, pushing Governor Pritzker, thinking about how we activate some of those networks and all that infrastructure that's been built around system change in Chicago? Could we send Trump packing? Could we blunt the edge of this offensive against American cities? It would take a lot to pull that off, but it may well be better for us to weigh the benefits of doing that now versus the costs of waiting and having to try to do it later. We haven't chosen Chicago as our ground, but maybe Chicago has been chosen for us. And it's easy, of course, to say that from the DMV. I feel like I'm saying, April, we'll hold your coat, but that hasn't got to be the way in which this is done, right? We have to build the mother of all solidarity movements in this country at this moment, and to do it also internationally. And with that, I just want to say that's where we at TDC are also putting our money where our mouth is. And I want to announce that together with Kelly Akuno and others, we're organizing a solidarity knowledge exchange for for activists in American cities that will bring together American activists with our Irish comrades in the north of Ireland, with whom, by good chance, we've been engaged in a years-long deep dialogue around matters of imperialism, militarism, cultural preservation and protection, and community building and self-defense. And so on September the 25th, we'll be hosting a solidarity webinar aimed at bringing together activists from American cities with their counterparts in the Republican movement in the north of Ireland for a discussion of strategies for how to respond to Trump's troops on our streets and lessons from the military occupation of communities in the north of Ireland, an exercise which will be about knowledge sharing, but also about building international solidarity. And that will be at 9:30 on Thursday, September the 25th, and we'll be putting out more information on our website with the People's Network for Land and Liberation and others. So check that out, please. Join us. Let's figure out how we hold the line now rather than be sorry that we didn't do it later. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. And wow, there's so much that has been said, and so many emotions that have been evoked. And I'm just thinking back to the sense of joy and courage and spiritedness that we're hearing and seeing in DC, the connection, the relational organizing, the deep history in Chicago, the knowledge about the authoritarian playbook, how it has been operationalized and resisted and overcome, the analysis of what we're up against in terms of the assembling of a essentially paramilitary instrument of repression here in the United States, and ways that people have countered that in various settings. And I think also very important that runs through many of the comments that you've had to share, all of you, is just that one of the realities of this moment is the integration of next system alternatives with resistance, and that in various ways at different levels, at higher levels, and also at the very sort of personal and social psychological level, they are one and the same. And I just want to say a little bit about cities. Matt talked about cities and how much he likes cities. I think it's very important for us to recognize that cities and communities and regions are really the places where the next system has been most alive for a long time. It has been built, it has been living, to the extent that we have freedoms that we have services that we have ways of taking care of ourselves that we have. That's a result of next system work of prior generations, and also of us ourselves over the last decades. And I also just want to give a shout out to Los Angeles as well, to recognize that in fact they went after LA first, and that was probably a mistake. DC was the more obvious target, and that the people of Los Angeles showed us a thing or two, and that there are many of these cities and communities in which there has been so much deep work that has been done, and there are so many institutions. And there is such a sense of another world that is possible, that is alive in communities, that this is really, Chicago is where we make our stand for democracy, sustainability, and justice. But actually, every community is where we make that stand, and that the next system is in these communities. That is where we are, and that is also where the struggle is going to be fought, I think, for the most part. So I just want to, those are some of my thoughts listening to you. And what I want to do right now is something a little unconventional, at least for me. A lot of, I tend to be pretty orderly a lot of times. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on all of us collectively to keep our intervention short. I'm going to have a conversation here. And what I would ask the panelists to do, I know you've been reading the comments and the questions that have been appearing. You've been responding in text to them in many cases. But I would just like to open it up, since we have limited time, and to see, what thoughts you have, what questions you have for each other, because we want to have this conversation. So who would like to go first? And I will step in to move people along. I'll be a friendly but affirmative and aggressive mover of the conversation. Thank you, Stephanie.
I'll be brave here. I mean, one question that I do have, because people like, Jamila and others talked about sort of the, emerging vision, and I think there's a sort of a leadership question that's implicit. One thing that I'm grappling with a lot is that yes, a lot of movements are taking shape at the municipal level, which is also why it's, I think, so important to invest there. But at the national level, it's hard, like I think we've outsourced a lot of our organizing to the 501c3, C4 civil society, which has a lot of constraints on it. And I think also just really, really tired and maybe not exactly fit for purpose for what we're facing right now. And I just sort of, was wondering if you had comments on how you see that coming forward. And especially they can hold the sort of like system change questions as well and not be kind of purely reactive and utilitarian.
Don't worry about stepping on somebody else. If that happens, I'll step in and help you sort it out. I know, Matt, you have thoughts on this. I'm sure others do as well, but yeah. Maybe April does as well.
I actually thought the question was for Jamila.
Oh, I apologize.
No, for anybody. I was just saying that Jamila sort of mentioned it a little bit.
I'd like to hear from others. I'd like a chance to think about that, actually.
I mean, this maps against what we're seeing in terms of the development of systemic change alternatives, right? And I think we probably are going to find resistance coming from, in a way that Ben was suggesting, the places where some of that work has been further developed to the point where it's actually producing the connections to leadership and some of the other factors that we need. So I don't think it's a problem that that most of the activity is happening from the bottom up. I think that's actually something we need to lean into. I think it's something that in many ways this system is dysfunctional and blocks us and presents us with a lot of obstacles. But one thing we do have is federalism, decentralization, localism, the states, etc. And there are a whole range of building blocks we can use, and we're already starting to see even sort of deadbeat mainstream democratic leaders spot the opportunity that's emerging there. I'm thinking of the alliance that's starting to come out of California and Oregon and Washington on healthcare in resistance to what's being done with vaccines. I think we can see the way that Newsom clearly sees a path forward from California by showing kind of regional leadership, and maybe there'll be some of that in Illinois as well, with Pritzker, who's already been willing to step forward and say more. So I think it's not the sort of Washington milieu where in many ways they're kind of stalemated. And let's remember our history. Like Mussolini let the Italian parliament go clanking on for a year before he even bothered to shut it down because it become so toothless. And so for me, I think it's actually the states and the cities that are going to be the basis for our build and fight back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead, Matt, and then I'll go ahead.
Well, I part of what I hear in the question is like, how do we sustain and strengthen and maybe iterate and adapt? And I've learned so many lessons from, we did a series of about 50 events on the northern and southern border with groups on these borders. And it was like the first time it was simultaneous events on both borders. And the whole theme was friendship. And the theme of all the events had a component, even though people for sure on the southern border, sometimes had to walk 3 miles through barbed wire and across tanks, and there was like a mudslide in one of them, so it delayed their action a couple hours. But through tremendous adversity, they knew they were also building connections, building relationships, building friendships. And at the end of this, sort of the cross-border international coordinators, we were all tired, but so many of the groups were like, we're ready. We had an incredible, nourishing event and action that made people ready for the next one and the next one. And I think that part of this is to find that kind of virtuous cycle, find that abundance, and otherwise we're just going to continue to be drained. And so I'm really interested in how people are like gaining energy from, and I'm thinking of Free DC, how do we make it engaging, make it friendship based, in some ways even like bring the joy, bring the yes, so that people are like, yes, fuck y'all, and we're building to the point of like every day we're ready because we're being nurtured. And I think that's something that is not the culture of many nonprofits, and is not the culture of many, unfortunately, of many like social movement spaces. But I really think it has to be, just like there has to be a culture of debate and iteration and hard thinking around strategy. It can't just be, and it has to be in us. I think hopefully we're past the time of like, celebrity activists getting us through this, or like, this ethic of individualism, and individual leaders. I think we actually need something very different. And I think once we find it, then that just again creates a virtuous cycle.
Yeah. And I, I'll say that, I was trying to redirect the question, but I was also in the place of trying to, respond to questions and so on. I think I heard your question correctly. And part of the reason why I didn't jump on it immediately when there was a pause, Stephanie, is that I made a decision a very long time ago personally, as somebody who grew up in Jerusalem and then moved to Madison in 1982, and then grew up in the Democratic Party of Wisconsin as a kid and left the Democratic Party in 1992. And decided at that point that I was not going to go into the nonprofit industrial complex. And I've turned down jobs from the Sierra Club and the ACLU and Ralph Nader. I promised one of my mentors that I would never move into the DC Beltway, former executive director of Greenpeace, Richard Grossman. He said, the next time I return to Washington, DC, it will be either to see the cherry blossoms in the spring, which are worth visiting DC for, or at the head of a conquering army. So that was sort of my mentality for a long time, so I never became immersed in that. And as a professor now, who is a social movement scholar, I'm advising students all the time who are trying to figure out how to put their lives into movement work. And what I've generally advised is that there are plenty of jobs in nonprofits and also in unions in particular, and I try to help them make those connections, and there are internships and so on. But generally, I've advised them to build a life in which you're doing something meaningful and contributing to the community, and in which you're able to sustain yourself and you do your work from that position, and not as somebody who's earning a paycheck based on advocacy work and so on. So I might have missed the question, but I guess my point is simply this: that I think that I am unconvinced that the Big Ten and the environmental sector and that most of the major nonprofit organizations contributed as much as they held us back over the last 30 to 40 years, and I've always put my sort of faith in associational work and so on, and working through institutions, including universities, workplaces, and so on. So basically, everybody's got to unionize, whatever that means, and build person to person, member to member organization. And I apologize that I missed the central point of your question and provocation, but maybe that's. Tell me if that was way off.
No, I think that's totally, no, that was implicit in my question. Okay. My question is to some extent, given that is not a pole of leadership, but I don't really feel that there are a lot of, I think there's been a lot of very strong local level leadership and some like traditional movements as well. But I'm still a little bit worried that we haven't necessarily knit together the local stuff with sort of a more like national vision. And I guess my question is more around how do people see that emerging, especially like a leadership, because it's exactly because people do have their incentives, which are not necessarily aligned with system change.
That's the part that I missed.
Sorry, I may not have enunciated it very well.
And there was a comment on this that was, I think, maybe sparked by something I said earlier about Next System not only being about economic change, but about political change. And so I think if communities are where we've built our strength and they're under attack, it is through communities that we have to build that national and international infrastructure. And this is very old strategy for revolutionary change. You have the committees of correspondence in the American Revolution, the councils that produced the Soviet Union, the history of abolition in the United States. Then you can go through country after country, and it's an important strategy. But it takes very deliberate work to unite communities, and not just through their elected officials and representatives, but through the people themselves in each community. So I think that is the general direction that I think that needs to be taken and invested in. And who else?
Quick thought, just you referenced the meeting with the mayor. So the Chicago Peace Fellows had a chat with the mayor, both the alumni and the current fellows, a couple of weeks ago. And one of his, and I do think it was coming from a real place, right? Because of his background. One of his biggest messages was that, in this moment where we're looking down the barrel of this dictator, right? Wannabe dictator, saying certain things about our city as an excuse to come in. We all know, right, that it is your work on the ground that allows us to say that we have hard numbers, that our crime has been reduced, right, over the last decade significantly, right? And also, the spirit of accountability, I think that was in that room, because of how Mayor Johnson came up, right, through the labor movement, through Chicago Teachers Union. And of course, not everybody loves the mayor, right? But there was a recognition, I think, and a solidarity there with the grassroots that we also see in the policies, right, of our mayoral administration. So I think that there's something there of how that flows upward. And I agree, I don't think we figured out how to knit that all the way to the national level. But I do think that there's a lot to be found in municipalism. I know that in where has been my field for most of my life, on the hyper local neighborhood scale, like we've gotten very good at that block level, neighborhood level relational that sometimes translates into decision making. But there's a ways to go to link that with things like people's assemblies, right? These other tools that have been developed in other spaces, to see that as a way to flow into citizen decision making, citizen community member decision making, and then link that with leadership that is accountable to those structures, right, of co-governance. And yeah, I mean, I conceptually can see, but I don't think we have good examples to point to, other than the fact that what I'm seeing with this flow between the grassroots in Chicago to the mayor, and then what we're also seeing with the governor, who, right, is standing up to the federal level.
Thank you. What next? What do we want to introduce? Or are there further thoughts on this important set of questions? Jamila.
I mean, I think we're really focusing on Stephanie's question, but I think it's such a key one. And I think it's one that's key for not just the US, but, movements around the world. And I think I think about this a lot. And I think about it in the context of places where there's like severe cost to organizing, right? Really repressive environments where people say there's no national level leadership, there's no central strategy. Like, how are we supposed to figure out what to do? Meanwhile, we all kind of agree on some basic things. And I wonder in that context, like, how we can enable people to act in these local ways. I think that's already happening, right? People are making sense of the harms in their community, like the local manifestation of the national level injustices that are happening, and figuring out how to mobilize against them. So then I think, like sharing the success stories is really important, like broadcasting them, understanding like what's working, what isn't working, trying to kind of pull out the insights that can be used elsewhere. And so I think like having a collection of almost like case studies and examples of how US people are resisting, a lot of people have been asking for that. So I'm wondering if people have access to resources, things that can almost be used as like training tools or can inform the thinking and planning planning space for these groups that are, getting activated and trying to figure out what to do. Because I think at the end, it really is like it's too much to ask to have perfect coordination. It's too much to ask to have national level strategy. And I don't think we should expect that. Meanwhile, we can still be very effective and very coordinated. And I think that means like, is there a strategic logic to the actions and the tactics that we're using at the local level? And maybe some guidelines on how do different actions work and what circumstances should they be used? When do we call for a boycott? When do we call for a general strike? What capacity do we need to have? Do we have capacity to withstand repression that's inevitable? Could our movement turn to violence? I think there's some basic do's and don'ts that are not widely disseminated. So I think just as there's a training piece, there's also a public education piece. And I think that would go a really long way in kind of, bringing some discipline and like strategy to our movements.
Thank you. I agree. I agree. There's and as soon as you said that, I thought, yes, we desperately do need that right now, and some of that exists. So one thing we can do is work to help it to proliferate. And I know, Stephanie, you shared a resource earlier in the chat. Maybe you'd like to speak to that. I know, Jamila, there's plenty of resources at AEI. I know Waging Nonviolence and in various other organizations have a lot of resources. So that maybe that's one takeaway here, probably.
So then what is that, I guess, like in practice or pedagogically? There are a couple references to the Montgomery bus boycott, but my understanding of that history is like, at first the demands were very lightweight. The original demands were like just less brutal segregation. And it wasn't until people got in a room, strategized, organized, debated, came together that then they realized that, okay, the demands could be much bigger and this movement could be much bigger. And in that difference is the magic. The magic, otherwise we would have just been left with like, less brutal segregation. I think the original demand was like, it can be separate seating, but it just shouldn't be that when, the whitesies are taken that you get displaced. And that was like, and people are like, oh, okay, we could probably win that. But I think that like, I really think that in that transformation that then we saw history play out, that's the magic I want to know for today. Like, where are those meetings? What do we need to do to kind of make that gumbo happen in a good way? Nationally, because again, this was became a national strategy.
I did want to make sure we acknowledge Daisy's question. I think it's an important one. It's an elephant in the room.
Which is a question I don't know that everybody who's here as an attendee can see. I think only we can see
okay.
we answer it. So I could verbalize it, which is, I am also Colombian, and I know some approaches from social movement scholars in Latin America acknowledge that nonviolence is not always an option to all, especially for communities facing acute repression or existential threats, such as in areas of extreme or armed conflict. For many groups in the global south, nonviolence can be seen as a privilege, and it looks like and then not equally available to everybody. So that was the general question, and then it went away there because it's being answered. So that is a critical question. I do think Colombia is an important case because you look at my understanding of the transformation of Colombia over the last 30 years since the Constitution of 1991 and what has happened in various stages, and Daisy could correct me on this, but what I've seen is it has actually been through the cities and through people who come out of armed conflict who have brought a different kind of municipal politics to Colombia, and that has been a major force in terms of the transformation of Colombia to the extent that has happened. But I'm interested in what people have to say about this question of violence and nonviolence as well. Thank you for posting that in the chat. Appreciate it, April.
I feel like everybody here certainly has a perspective. I don't know. Does somebody who hasn't spoken yet want to start?
I can jump.
All right, I can jump in. We do go into nonviolence in all of the trainings for the free DC. We have trainings happening every other day, and people are asking similar questions, but it just overwhelming evidence for global experiences, from India, from South Africa, and my lived experience from Eastern Europe, from Serbia. It's not a matter of privilege. It can be, I guess, but even in the places where the regimes were really willing to go all the way, it still backfired. It still was important to maintain discipline, to maintain nonviolence, and sooner or later the backlash would be so big that it was impossible to ignore it. One thing that I wanted to ask, and I'm acknowledging that it's very late in this session to ask a question, but in the theory that we are also preaching, the theory where we are trying to peel off support of the main pillars of the regime, the theory that worked so well in many countries. I don't know how do we do it in United States, and this I'm asking as someone who hasn't lived here for a long time. In other countries, if you are to, the end game, the end of the regime is when a critical mass of people switch sides, right? We know that in the core of the pillars of support, those cores are going to remain loyal because they benefit from the regime in many ways. But if each pillar rests just on cores, it's going to crash down. So how do we peel off these outer layers of the pillars of the regime? In many countries, this happens kind of organically because people interact with each other, in the streets, in schools, in shops. But United States, it kind of puzzled to me because people don't interact as much. I mean, in DC, where I live now, is a bit different. There are still people on the streets and we see each other, but we are a predominantly democratic city. So somewhere else, in the places where you come from, do you even see people who vote differently? And how would you interact with people who are outer layers of support where you come from? And I'm sorry, it's a big question. I'm sorry to introduce it so late.
Fine. Who's next?
Just to agree with what Matt was saying in the chat about provocation, I think violence is coming. I think the regime is intent upon provoking violence. I think we have to be as disciplined as we possibly can and realize that they want that as a means of escalation. And I think it's probably impossible to avoid all forms of violence in a society as violent as this one already. And there's, of course, violence happening every day from the regime itself. So this is just going to be a constant process of vigilance and understanding where the traps are and where we're being baited and where we're being led into escalation, which can only serve the purposes of the plan that's already being rolled out against us. So it's a very dangerous and difficult situation.
I could just add, and I think also I totally agree about the way in which violence by the movement is used as a pretext for a crackdown. We've seen that throughout history, but also that that there's a way in which it really decreases movement effectiveness, right? And we've seen that's because it reduces participation, mass participation. I mean, violence, we could, we're not talking about nonviolence as a ideology or a creed. We're talking about this as a strategic tool. We're not asking people to become, pacifists. We're saying that in this case, this movement needs to be nonviolent and to be disciplined. And that doesn't mean there's going to be zero violence. And we know that just because a movement is nonviolent doesn't mean that going to be met in a kind and gentle way. That's not how it works. But movements have been able to withstand repression, extreme repression, in fact, and that repression has been made to backfire. So there are dynamics at play. I think that, I'm seeing a lot of this conversation in the US right now. I think there's a desire to be good allies to marginalized people and then sometimes justify unwise behavior. And I think we need to be very careful. And this isn't anything, moralistic. We can understand why people want to use violence. We come from a society that tells us that's how we have won our freedoms, that this is how we got our rights, that the good kind of violence, the one we use, is acceptable. We should support it. So I understand that's that's a driving force in our society. But turning to violence as a movement is going to put people in harm's way, including the very people that we want to protect, because marginalized people are the first ones that are going to be targeted by police. So I think we just need to be really careful about, making some types of violence allowable. And again, not with the moralistic argument, but really with the strategic one.
Go ahead.
I just want to add, I mean, I think, violence is it's a response of last resort. And there are quite a few things that we have not fully explored and tried yet. Yeah, exactly, like mass non-compliance, withholding labor, international solidarity as well. Like, we're very isolationist in this country, and there's a lot more that that we could try to convince people around the world to help us with. And we saw that with the Tesla takedown, how important the international side of the boycotts were. So there's definitely much more to do. At the same time, progressives in the past, like, they were the ones who fought for the responsibility to protect as a doctrine in international law. At times of genocide and mass human rights abuse and so on. So I don't want to be the kind of the person who says that the communities don't have a right to defend themselves under certain circumstances, and that we should all, it should always be a situation of nothing about us without us. Including in situations of how to respond to mass violence. I hope we never get to that stage. I'm not talking about America. I'm speaking sort of just more theoretically, but that there are different times for in different uprisings as well, and different kinds of repression.
And I actually, this may sound odd. I actually think we need to do much better at confronting violence and stopping violence. And, two examples. One is with the southern border work. There's a group who bring water. They bring water to stop the extreme violence that's happening in southern. But they bring it in ice because ice melts. And they've just had a lot of conversations about when we melt ice, we bring life. But it's a way to sort of inspire people to also confront ICE, the repressive, paramilitary machine that just got 10 times its budget. I think that kind of, sort of narrative and, kind of built into the training, that when you're bringing ice to then melt to bring life, you're also making a commitment to confront ICE as a violent force. I'll also say that there are a lot of people within these brutal regimes who just get caught up. Again, when I was in Milwaukee, I mentioned my early Marxist officer who would torture people. The two other officers who he was with and watched him torture somebody, one of them came into my coffee shop at the time, because he lived in the neighborhood. He knew I was active, and he basically said he wanted to confess, and he wanted out. He wanted out of the police force. He wanted out of the cycle of violence. And it took him being powerless, watching his, blue colleague, literally torture somebody in front of him to do that. And so it's like, I could be a place where we could together confront his violence. And I think that unfortunately, there's so many opportunities to actually directly engage in dialogue with the violence that we see, far, far too much. Last thing I'll say is, when I was in the Ferguson uprising, I was tremendously inspired by the level of discipline in confronting violence. Because to tell you the truth, I'm going to say about a third of the people were armed, you know, on all sides. But it was the tremendous commitment, discipline, clarity of thought to understand how to continue and build and sustain movements. You know, they needed to literally keep their firearms in their holsters while protest.
Yeah, I think this is such a complex issue, right? And I think it's you know, speaking to folks here in Chicago this week, I think the leading message, right, and the spaces and the trainings that are being offered and organized, you know, come from the spirit of we don't want to give anything that will give them an excuse to do what they want to do to us, right? So to avoid any provocation as well as any chance to be written into the narrative that they're trying to build about our city. And so we must be disciplined in that. And at the same time, you know, I take Dacey's point, and personally, my own instincts lean towards, you know, we know what they're trying to do, right? And so there is a level of, you know, do we just completely allow ourselves to be, you know, if it should come to the very worst, not have some kind of other means of protection if everything else fails, right? Stephanie, like you were saying, as a means of last resort. I've been graphically illustrating the Kali Akuno's Build and Fight series, and Cooperation Jackson, and his most recent second to last episode is on community self-defense. You know, and so that has a very different point of view, right? Which is that you know, we should be ready, right? We shouldn't be naive. So I find that also the spirit of respecting communities to come up with their own ethic of defense, and really trusting communities to do that. There was an excellent article on community self-defense in Yes Magazine, which is unfortunately now dead, that really had several cases where I think there was several indigenous communities that, you know, had a very disciplined arm of, you know, last resort self-defense that did have firearms, but they were able to, you know, stave off white supremacist and fascist attempts on their community gatherings because they had a very disciplined, you know, last resort option there. So yeah, I don't think it's simple. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I wasn't trying to cut you off, but just to say, yeah, I think this is an important conversation that is happening actively and needs to happen more actively. And I'm just thinking back to the question you raised, Matt, about where are these conversations happening, right? And they need to happen more and more. And you know, one thing that I don't have a clear sense of is, for example, how many conversations are happening between Free DC and the Chicago Teachers Union, which I regard to be really pivotal institution in the city of Chicago, and folks in LA on an ongoing basis. And are there ways that those conversations, if they're not already happening in an active way, can be supported? And you know, what are some of the next steps? You were talking about resources, Jamila, that need to be shared, and information, and also, you know, these are questions that need to be taken up collectively. I'll say, you know, personally, you know, I can think of many times, sort of like what Matt was sharing, where, in fact, in some of these times, Matt, you were there as well in the Northwoods of Wisconsin with me, where, you know, there were incidents in which, you know, most people were armed. In northern Wisconsin, most people have firearms, and yet there was a very you know, disciplined nonviolence nonetheless. And one case in particular with a warrior society of the Anishinaabe and Ogeechee Band at Bad River blocking the railroad tracks to stop a shipment of sulfuric acid to a mining site in the UP, in which something really important happened. They were there. Firearms were visible. Some of us went up as witnesses for nonviolence to provide that kind of support. And then the governor tried to bring in the FBI and wanted repression. And the sheriff decided he was going to place a squad car across the railroad tracks to protect his community. So this is a white sheriff in a community in a county that has a very large Anishinaabe in particular population. And I've had many experiences with like that over the years. When the Wisconsin uprising happened in 2011, with over 1 million people taking part and hundreds of thousands of people in the streets and industrial strikes, there was almost no violence. There were almost no arrests. The governor tried to call out the National Guard. They refused on the first day of the uprising. And I could point to many other examples. So this is actually a way for me to transition to a question that you raised earlier, Slobo, saying you're newer to the U.S. What's it like outside of D.C.? And I could just tell you that there are people in small towns all across the United States who are very much a part of this movement and doing work as well. And that I've also encountered, as probably many people have, but I encounter it a lot here in Northern Virginia, many people who come out of the military, who come out of intelligence, who come out of sort of very deep commitments and a sense of service, who actually believe, who take their oaths of office seriously, who are extremely concerned as well. And I'm reminded that, but for the refusal of our military to violate their constitutional oaths on January 6th, we would not be having this conversation in 2025, but we would have been having this conversation in 2020 and 2021. So there's just a number of things I was sharing there, yeah, I see that there's some resources that were shared here. Thank you for sharing that, April. Why don't we do this? Because we have gone over, and I didn't ask actively about this. I'm happy to continue going for a while, but I also want to respect, people are doing all kinds of important things. I see Stephanie, your hand there. So let's go to Stephanie, and then depending on where the energy is, we'll maybe have a wrap up, or maybe we'll keep going. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, my apologies. I do need to jump, but thank you all so much. There's a bit of a strategy session on how to protect the rule of law in New Orleans, given that it might be next on the target list, unfortunately. But yeah, thank you all so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you. Last thoughts? Well, then what I will do is I will say thank you. I will say thank you to everybody for all the energy you put in today, to the Next System Convergence. I'm just reminded that this is part of a larger process. Tomorrow morning, many of us will be getting together for the organizing conference for the Next System Teach-ins. We're organizing these teach-ins on the Next System in communities on college campuses in November, at a time in which, this is another way to address Matt's question earlier, that people can come together and address, the same questions we've been talking about tonight. I want to thank you, Jamila Raqib. I want to thank you, Slobodan Milic. I want to thank you, Matt Nelson, April Donor, and Joe Guinan. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to everybody who's gathered tonight for all your work. This is to be continued, because inevitably it will be, and we'll see each other in these spaces and in others in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you so much.